Okay, so I think this is recording. This was actually, I actually started a few minutes ago, and now it's starting. Okay, never mind. I'm having computer issues. So I wanted to finish up a few little ideas as y'all are getting ready to do your Loyalist letter journal. And of course, I showed you this picture. I showed all the classes this picture of Boston and kind of the American depiction of Boston. After the course of acts, and kind of this idea that Boston is being sacrificed on the Liberty Tree. And we talked about the First Continental Congress, wrapping things up with this Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and really just kind of advocating for this kind of moderate course of action where they deny Parliament has the right to rule, and yet at the same time they are also calling for more of a boycott and really trying to get the message out there. Now, not all the classes got to Lexington and Concord, so I'm going to quickly kind of revisit that. So Lexington is where you had the arms and ammunition storehouse. They get word that the British are coming to take that and remove that from the colonials. And so people get upset, right? Paul Revere has his ride, and you have kind of this early kind of spy network going on. You get the Minutemen rushing out of their homes to protect this storehouse of weapons. Now, of course, one thing that historians kind of debate is, is this a legal storehouse of weapons? It's not legal in the sense of it's not permitted by the British government. Now, understand that in the colonies, there hadn't been a whole lot of effort to remove weapons from the colonists because they needed them on a regular basis, right? They just weren't supposed to have this massive storehouse. So, massive, it wasn't massive, but they weren't supposed to have a large cache of weapons and ammunition. And so the British are coming to take that away, and the colonists get very upset. Get concerned that, again, they're going to start taking away all their weapons. And remember that there's some context for this, like if you think in terms of Ireland and the way they had treated the Irish and stuff like this. And most of your settlers at this point are not going to be Irish, but they would have been familiar with kind of how that went down. Especially given the education level of most American colonists. So they're going to get very upset. The Minutemen are going to rush out. They're going to basically confront the British. They're going to be essentially defeated. The British are going to march on to Concord. But then in Concord, they're going to push them back to Boston. So it really kind of ends in a draw. Except if you look at the fact that you really have almost a 3-to-1 difference in casualties between the Americans and between the British and the Americans. And so just kind of keep in mind that this is significant for a couple of reasons. First off, that the Americans clearly show that they weren't afraid to stand up to the British military, that the British military was not going to get a pass just because of who they were. And the other aspect here is this is happening in 1775, which is, before, this is over a year before the Declaration of Independence is sent out. Really two levels of resistance going on. You have kind of the official version, which has to do with the colonial assemblies and the Continental Congress and things like circular letters and committees of correspondence and boycotts and non-importation and all that kind of thing. That's very nice and neat and official. And then you're going to have this mob activity. And the mob activity at times is very violent, and certainly, if in one perspective, can justify the British reprisals. But also in another perspective, you can think in terms of, well, except, the British kind of keep going overboard, especially with Boston, right? They keep treating Boston like they're the ones that are all to blame. And these issues are really being felt all over the colonies. So I would almost argue that it's with Lexington and Concord that you kind of see the merging of these two forms of resistance. And it's not, and I don't mean to suggest that Lexington and Concord are terroristic. I mean to suggest that this is where it stops being about kind of that, we have that official response, and then you have those people like Sam Adams that do crazy stuff, right? This is where it's no longer about Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty. Now, were some of these Minutemen also Sons of Liberty? Probably. There's probably you're going to see that overlap, but you're going to have people that would not have participated with mob activity, that wouldn't have done that are going to be called to action because of them trying to seize this storehouse because of what happens at Lexington and Concord. And so I really think this is kind of where we shift that perspective, where these two different forms of resistance kind of merge into one thing. And so, again, it's kind of an interesting dilemma when you think about the Sons of Liberty and whether or not, they were right. Whether or not, their behavior justified British reprisals. I think that it's just one way of kind of trying to understand the complexity of this situation. And it wasn't as simple as the British were bad and the Americans were good. Like every conflict, there's nuances to it. And I think one of the nuances is that there are times that the Americans, the Sons of Liberty, don't do things the way they ought to, and they actually tend to make the problem worse rather than making it better. That being said, some don't agree with the Continental Congress. The Loyalists, this is where they start to emerge. This comes about really because of the non-importation, right? They're upset about the lack of trade. There's people whose livings are tied up with this, right? They're upset that this is going down. And they're kind of tired of the boycotts and that sort of thing. And now that you have Lexington and Concord happening, there's this real sense that it's starting to get real serious, right? We're not just, it's just the Sons of Liberty, and it's not just, they're sending another letter. It's starting to get serious. And then you're going to see that Parliament's going to dissolve, the legislature in Massachusetts. They're going to basically force kind of this military control of Boston. And so for people that are looking at the Quebec Act and thinking, okay, this is the future of the American colonies, where they essentially remove our legislatures and our representation, this really hits close to home. So again, the reaction of the British to Lexington and Concord is going to tend to encourage people to take this threat more seriously. So again, it's kind of like this classic misunderstanding where Americans are doing things that are provoking a reaction, and the reaction is provoking Americans to do things. And it just keeps getting more and more tense, ultimately ending with the Congress being recalled and Parliament declaring the colonies in rebellion. Now, this picture right here is a British depiction of Americans, particularly the committees of correspondence. A couple things I'll point out here. Notice the very cartoonish look. Some of these women are not attractive. Some of these women are clearly being a little too friendly with the gentlemen. They're not even able to take care of their children. It's the women who are writing the letter. It's, what you see is kind of this depiction of the Americas being dominated by women and being kind of influenced in that way. And it's really meant to be an insult towards the will of the Americans, if you will. And so I just always find that to be a kind of amusing picture. This is a depiction of Lexington and Concord, as well as a map that kind of shows you this path where they come up into Lexington, which is where the storehouse was. They move on to Concord. The Americans defeat them at Concord, and they return back to Boston. So kind of gives you a sense of kind of how that went down. George Washington takes command, in 1775. And this is, of course, after Lexington and Concord. This is after shots have been fired. This is before the Declaration of Independence. So I think when you start considering the timeline of events, it becomes very interesting how this stuff kind of plays out, especially when you're trying to understand which comes first, and when you're trying to understand, okay, so what is the purpose of the Declaration of Independence, right? It's very clear that the Americans are heading towards independence, or at least heading towards full open rebellion, right? We're having shots fired. They've named a military commander. We've got all these things kind of beginning to coalesce. So I think it kind of affects our perception when you look at it that way of what the Declaration of Independence is meant to do. And so Americans are clearly, one of the big points of this whole process of frustration with the British Parliament is not just the fact that they're constantly denying the right of Parliament to control them, but it's also about the fact that they're essentially refusing their British identity. They're saying, clearly we are different, and Parliament can never understand us. And so you have, over the course of, 1764 to 1775, you have this progression of the Americans, not just in how they respond to what Britain's doing, not just in, mob activity or the unity from the circular letter to committees of correspondence and so forth, a stamp resolution, circular letter, committees of correspondence. But what you also see is that now they're essentially going to say, we can never make Parliament understand. Parliament will never understand what we're dealing with. And so we're going to embrace the fact that we are indeed unique. And I think that's the thing that's the big idea here, which is that the American colonies were unique. They were started uniquely. They were developed uniquely. They had always been unique. They were never just like Britain, as much as they shared commonalities with Britain. They share a common heritage, right? They share affection for some of the same modes of representation. But at the end of the day, their experiences are completely different, and this makes them respond very, very differently. And really, everyone perceives liberty as being the goal. The reason they're fighting this war is to preserve liberty. Now, liberty is going to mean different things to different people. But that's why we tend to elevate the term liberty. That's why we elevate the term freedom, right? Because for us, for Americans, liberty and freedom is what it's all about. And for some of us, it's liberty to say what I want, read what I want, go where I want. For others, it's about a style of life or quality of life. Or for some people, it's about keeping as much of my money and as much of my property as I possibly can. And so the meaning of liberty still has shades of meaning for different people. And it had shades of meaning back then as well. So I definitely think that it's worth you kind of understanding that. And, if you think in terms of like the English Revolution, and if you think in terms of, of kind of Cromwell, there's definitely a trend in English society to be difficult, to stand up to authority. So, again, maybe it is really true. So when does the revolution start, right? That's the big question. Does it start with the Declaration of Independence? Does it start with Lexington and Concord? Does it start with putting Washington as the commander of the Continental Army, recalling the Second Continental Congress? I don't know. I mean, there's historians that debate this all the time. This is not a resolved question. And at the end of the day, for a survey class, I don't know that it really matters. What matters is the unique identity that Americans embrace. What matters is that unique identity all along had kind of set things in motion, certainly since 764, but one could argue really since like 1607. That things were set in motion that were going to basically mean that Americans were going to be different, and they were going to have to be their own country because of the way they viewed things, the way they valued things, and the way they approached things, and then just the very unique circumstances of having this Western expansion. That also kind of goes along with kind of the ideas of race, the ideas of civilization that we've seen expressed in the development of slavery, that we've seen expressed in the treatment of American Indians. And these things all kind of manifest themselves very uniquely in Americans in a way that they don't other places. Now, that being said, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, right, very clearly we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're claiming these natural rights. In essence, they are justifying Lexington and Concord with the natural right argument. Okay, so they're doing this after the events have happened. It's kind of like you getting busted or you being caught having a bad grade, and you explaining, well, I got a bad grade because, I wasn't able to study because of this and this and this, or explaining to your parents, well, I missed my curfew because, well, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. And these reasons can be very justified, right? That doesn't change the fact that you can have good reasons for why things happen. But it also means that, calling it essentially a causation for American independence is not the correct way to look at this. This is the justification for independence. This is the justification for things that have already happened. And this is what's happening in 1776. This is why the artistry of this document is so very important, because this document really kind of lays before the entire world not only the natural rights argument of these truths are self-evident, but then also that there has been this attempt by the colonies to work with Great Britain, and Great Britain has refused to work with them. right? And they basically go into, I mean, the preamble says it all, right? We are telling mankind what has happened so that they can understand why we're doing this. Now, the perspective on why they're doing it is going to vary. You're going to have, British that totally disagree. They're going to be like, there's no excuse for this, right? I don't care what you say. You didn't really have, abuses and injuries and usurpations, right? But there's also going to be people that are going to look at the actions of them shutting down Boston Harbor, of them removing the colonial legislature, of them suspending the New York legislature, of them passing these laws that are intended to force revenue from the colonies. People are going to look at those things and say, yeah, but I think you were. I think you were trying to injure us, usurp us, take away our power, and really just treat us like we were slaves. Now, the argument about the American, sensitivity to slavery, even in 1776, is kind of an interesting one, and that might well be true. But I think it just all depends on how you're looking at the argument, what your perspective is, and really what you value most. If what you value most is trade and economic security, you're probably going to be a loyalist, and you're going to look at that, and you're going to look at this argument and go, yeah, but none of that beats out the benefits that we have being with the British Empire. But if what you value is this idea of self-determination and individualism, and your right to, move west and go claim property and go be your own person, if that's what you value, then you're going to totally believe in the Declaration of Independence. So what we'll be talking about through the Revolution is really how the British end up losing the hearts and minds of the Loyalists, and how they really kind of, again, continue to mismanage the whole situation. So again, I just wanted to be sure you knew that the Declaration of Independence is really about convincing other countries about what's happening. To what extent they're thinking in terms of, maybe we can get some support from another country. I don't know. At this point, I mean, that could be in the game plan. I doubt it. I think it's more just trying to keep other countries from interfering in a way that's going to make it even harder than picking a fight with the British Army. So very quickly, Loyalists, Patriots, and Moderates. So should there be a revolution? 1775-76, and that's kind of what your journal is about. Should there be a revolution? What is the justification for staying within the British Empire? So, your Patriots were about 2/5 of the population. So if we divided the colonial population into 5 parts, and this is kind of an approximation, so this isn't like specific, but it's approximation. If you took about 2 of those 5 parts, you would have people that said, you know what, absolutely there should be a revolution. We should be independent. We believe in our right to property. We believe in our right to move west. We don't like the fact that they're quartering soldiers in our homes. We don't like the fact that they're telling us where we can go. We don't like the trend that we've seen with them suspending assemblies. We don't like the trend that we've seen with them increasing taxation and with them creating taxes, taking them away, and then creating them in a different way, right? Because that's the one thing we've seen is how they create taxes and remove them, and then, oh, wait a minute, we took down the Stamp Act, but now there's going to be a tax on paper. Oh, we're going to take down the Townsend Acts, but we're going to keep the one on tea. Oh, and then we're going to create a whole different act that's related to tea. So, people are going to be concerned about this, and this is going to be kind of this the large portion of people that make up your independent farmers, and I don't mean plantation owners, I mean your farmers in the middle colonies in New England that, have some degree of independence, your artisans that live in the cities and the towns. Those people are really going to find an appeal. You're going to have people like Sam Adams and Thomas Paine. You're going to have Patrick Henry. And these are men who are not necessarily your farmer types, but they are men who are kind of in that middling economic range, and they are definitely very sensitive to the ideas of liberty and property and that kind of thing. You're going to have about 2/5, about an equal number, that are what we would call moderates, right? They don't like how Britain's been acting. They have a problem with the taxation. They have a problem with creating revenue. They particularly have a problem with the suspension of the assemblies and with the presence of British troops and kind of the issues that have come from that. They find it being very disruptive, and they kind of blame the British for not trying to understand the Americans and not trying to really kind of respond in a way that would respect American independence. I mean, a moderate's mindset is going to be, we went for a really long time with very little influence from you, so why are you suddenly all concerned? Like why do you care now, I guess, is kind of the idea. And like for them, this whole argument about the cost of the French and Indian War is not really ringing true. And so they're kind of, they're not completely sold on, oh, Britain's right, we just need to suck it up. But they're also not completely sold that independence is right, because they're the ones who are seeing, what if we have trouble with Indians? What if we have a slave uprising? What if we can't get along? What if we start fighting with each other? And they're very nervous about that, and these are real concerns. And some of the discussion journals, rather, that I've previewed have kind of pointed this out, have said, these regional conflicts are real. Like, we haven't really liked each other until, like, pretty recently. And even then, we don't really like each other. We're just finding a way to work together. And so this is a real criticism. So what's going to happen is that it's going to be these moderates that they lose. Your loyalists are only about 1/5 of the population. They are not the majority. Now, they do typically, they were typically the ones who were in governmental positions. They were also the ones that had very strong economic ties. So they're your merchants, your people that are involved in finance. Some of your plantation owners aren't particularly sold on this whole idea of independence because of their close economic relationship with Great Britain, or with their political kind of influence because of that, right? And they just don't, they disavow the whole parliamentary argument. They're like, virtual representation. I mean, we just need to suck it up. We need to play nice. We need to fulfill our obligations. And those people don't buy into the notions of the Declaration of Independence. And so just kind of keep in mind that the Declaration of Independence is in part going to be intended to convince moderates, to create not only convince your French or your Spanish to mind their own business, not only to justify to the Whigs in Parliament, but to justify to the moderates that, hey, there's, this stuff has kind of developed and happened very quickly, but there's sound reasons for why we're doing what we're doing. So again, they're justifying the behavior after the fact. And that doesn't make the document any less meaningful or any less significant, but it does mean that to truly understand its purpose, what it was intended to do. And this would be particularly relevant if we were looking at the original draft that includes huge slave passages and some stuff like that they clean up. But you definitely see that that it's going to become, we hold this document up, and it's a justification for this, and it's a justification that's meant to convince ourselves, as well as the rest of the world, that having this kind of system of government is the way to go. So all of this to be said, that this has to do with it being a mission statement, okay? So when we come in on Thursday, we will kind of pick up here. I'll make sure everybody kind of watch this. We'll go into a little more detail about the American Revolution, but I wanted to tie up those loose ends and be sure you kind of heard kind of my take on the Loyalists, Patriots, moderates, and kind of where that is.